Welcome to Scientist Citizen, Promise and Peril, Science Policy in the Age of Promise and Peril, excuse me. My name is Jared Munshine. I'm the immediate past president and the organizer of this event from the Science Policy Society. We're a graduate student-run organization that aims to teach graduate students about the connection between their research that they're doing in the lab and public policy, also with an emphasis on the importance of science communication and the training of that. Before we get started, I just want to go through a few business items. First, I want to thank our very generous sponsors, the Materials Research Institute, the Penn State Institute for Energy and the Environment, the Department of Chemistry, the Institute for Cyberscience, the Center for Molecular Immunology and Infectious Diseases, the Earth System Science Center, the Graduate and Professional Student Association, and the Office of the Vice President for Research. Also, after Seth, the moderator right next to me, is going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. There are two Science Policy Society members in the back. In your right of the room is Grayson, and on the left of the room is Tia. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and they'll race over to you as soon as they can with the microphone, so you can ask our esteemed panel your question. Also, if you'll notice in your program booklet, there's a little slip of paper for you to fill out a quick survey for us. We would greatly appreciate if you did so. I think there are writing utensils available in the back of the room. And on your way out, please drop that off in a box that we have for you. So without further ado, Seth Borenstein is an award-winning science writer for the Associated Press. He also serves as an adjunct professor at the Washington, D.C. campus of New York University. Among other honors, he received the Edward J. Meeman Award for Environmental Reporting from the Scripps Foundation in 2007. And the top individual award for beat reporting from the Society of Environmental Journalists in 2008. He was part of an AP Gulf of Mexico oil spill reporting team that won the 2010 George Polk Award for Environment Reporting and a Special Merit Award as part of the 2011 Grantham Environmental Reporting Prizes. He was part of a team of finalists for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. A science and environmental journalist for more than 20 years, he has covered everything from hurricanes to space shuttle launches, to the issue of human-caused climate change and its impacts. Borenstein has also worked for Knight Ridder newspaper's Washington Bureau. Seth has flown in zero gravity and once tried out for the Florida Marlins. He is also co-author of 3 books on Hurricane Andrew, hurricane survival, and popular science. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Jared. We're not going to, our presenters won't be giving any opening remarks so we can have more time for questions. So let's start from your left to right. Peter Hudson is the director of the Huck Institutes of Life Sciences and the Williman Professor of Biology at Penn State. His research focuses on the ecology of wildlife diseases, including zoonosis. His group uses a mixture of field work and lab studies and mathematical modeling to explore disease dynamics. He's published more than 300 scientific articles during his career and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2008. He came here in 2003 from the University of Stirling in his native Great Britain, where he was, and in 2005 became director of the Huck Institutes. He also was a science advisor to the Prince of Wales, which is pretty impressive if you think of it.
I don't think you even listened.
And to Peter's right is Rush Holt. Rush Holt is currently Chief Executive of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, and Executive Publisher of the Science family of journals. He was U.S. Representative for New Jersey's 12th Congressional District from 1999 to 2015, and a member of the Democratic Party, and son of former Senator Rush D. Holt, Sr. He worked as a professor of public policy and physics, and during his tenure in Congress, he's one of 2 physicists in Congress. I think we're down to 3, and we're down to 1 now, right? We're just down to 1. He was a faculty member at Swarthmore College from 1980 to 1988, where he taught physics, public policy, and religion course. And during that time, he was also a Congressional Science Fellow for U.S. Representative Bob Edgar, Pennsylvania. And you should see him to talk to him about fellowships. He loves to talk about those. All right. And to Rush's right is Michael Mann. Michael Mann is the Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and Director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center here at Penn State. He's most known for the hockey stick. It seems to haunt him wherever he goes in both good and bad ways. And he is also the author of his most recent book, as he has several of them, is The Madhouse Effect with Tom Tolles, the editorial cartoonist at the Washington Post. He was selected by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002, was awarded the National Conservation Achievement Award of the NWF in 2013, made Bloomberg News list of 50 most influential people in 2013, and in 2014 he received the Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education. I could go on about all three of these gentlemen, but we have lots of questions. And let's start. I'll take the moderator's prerogative of starting a few questions. But before we do, the hashtag, if you are too shy to go to the microphone, and you shouldn't be, the hashtag is Scientist Citizen, and I will be following it here. If you want to ask a question by Twitter, I will try to get to it that way. But better to use the microphones. Also, these are Twitter handles of all of our participants. So this is called Science Policy in the Age of Promise and Peril. So we're going to start, and let's start in the center with the visitor to campus, Rush Holt, and then move on. What promise do you see out here, and what peril do you see in science, and I guess also in policy? What is the future, the good and the bad?
Well, first of all, you all look great. I will call you the future, the promise. No, it really is. It's great to be at Penn State, but it's great to see such a good turnout for this discussion. What science has brought us, does bring us, will bring us, is the stuff for volumes and volumes of discussion. We understand so much that has improved quality of life, public health, for example. Vaccinations, more about that later. We know how the world systems work, the ecology, the physical systems, enough so that we can predict where we're going. Climate change, for example, more about that later. We understand how cells protect themselves from viruses in ways that allow us to manipulate the genetic material to prevent genetic diseases. The list goes on and on. But and our social and behavioral sciences tell us a lot about how we can get along more peaceably. Those are things that really affect the quality of life. Now, every example I chose has a flip side. We have millions of Americans who are denying their kids vaccination, and what's troubling, millions more who say that's okay if that's what they want to do. We have millions of Americans who are denying the evidence about climate change that's right in their face. We have most American high school biology students not getting a satisfactory treatment of evolution in their classes. And as for social and behavioral sciences, when was the last time you heard an argument, a debate in economics that was based on evidence, rather than ideological assertions? Nobody treats that as an empirical science, which is the point I wanted to make. The big problem in front of us, the big peril, at least here in the United States, but I think to some extent elsewhere, is people have lost their respect for what we used to have in the United States, a reverence for evidence. That's the peril. More about that later, too.
Peter, let's go to you now. Same questions.
So I thought that was, is this on?
I hope.
Let's see if I can check. Oh yes, that sounds as if it's on now. So what a fascinating start from Rush. I thought that was really interesting. And that's even more frightening when you realize that 40% of Americans actually have a degree from a university college. And there is a high proportion of American citizens who still don't think that the Earth rotates around the sun. They think it's the other way around. So what is the peril, is the question. I think, so like Russia, I actually believe that what we've done in science for health, what we've done for biomedicine, what we've done for agriculture has just been phenomenal. It has been a remarkable change over the past century. Where I think we failed, and we failed very badly, is in the continued extinction of species, the loss of habitat that we're actually seeing. We're seeing extinction rates 100 times what they should be at the moment. We're losing habitat such that within my lifetime, I will see the black rhino go extinct. I will see the Sumatran orangutan go extinct. I will see the Iberian lynx go extinct. I will see turtles go extinct. In your lifetime, you may well see tigers, elephants, you may well see lions go extinct. That is horrific. And yet, we don't seem to be doing anything about it. There seems to be things which are really wrong, and I think we could do things about it, but it's just, it really worries me, that, and it keeps me awake at night.
Michael?
Well, I'm going to draw upon things that both Rush and Peter have said here, because there's actually a nexus in the case of many of the challenges that we face. And so, starting out with peril, there is, we are engaged in what has been described as the sixth major extinction event. And yes, extinctions do happen naturally. They happen 5 times in the geological past, but this one is being caused by us. And one of the things that is contributing to that is indeed climate change, as Rush mentioned. So, I'll focus on the issue of climate change because it challenges us in every facet of our lives, whether we're talking about food, water, land, health, national security, or our economy. After all, if we don't have a livable climate, we don't have an economy. Climate change has been described as perhaps the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization. And we are at a perilous moment. In fact, just weeks from now, we will have to make a decision as to whether we are going to build on the progress, and I'll talk about that shortly, that we've made in tackling this problem over the past few years, or whether we're going to throw that all out and revert to a fossil fuel-driven world where we continue to burn carbon, warm the planet, and change the climate in very dangerous ways. So that's the peril. We lie at the precipice, and it is literally true that if we choose to go backward, then it will be very difficult for us to limit climate change below truly dangerous and catastrophic, potentially irreversible levels. So there's an urgency to this problem, unlike anything we faced before. But that's where the promise lies. Because we have seen remarkable progress in recent years. We have seen an incredible escalation of renewable energy worldwide, and here in the US, electric vehicles. We have seen, for the first time in years, a decrease in global carbon emissions. Even as the global economy has continued to grow, we have seen a decrease in carbon emissions. Which indicates that we are starting to pivot away from a fossil fuel-driven global economy towards a renewable energy economy, and we're seeing it in the numbers that we're measuring. We also had this historic agreement just last year in December in Paris, where nearly 200 nations from around the world committed to substantial decreases in carbon emissions that won't solve the problem, make no mistake. The commitment that was made in Paris in that latest climate summit won't prevent warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius, which 3.5 Fahrenheit, which is often described as what constitutes dangerous and potentially irreversible climate change. But it gets us halfway from where we would be going toward truly catastrophic 7 to 9 Fahrenheit warming of the Earth. Gets us halfway to stabilizing the warming below that dangerous level. And it's easy to imagine a path where we build on that progress, and a few years from now, the same nations of the world come together and commit to even greater carbon reductions. We can now see a path towards stabilizing climate change below catastrophic levels. But the choice is up to us, and in part, the choice that we make in November will determine whether we take that path towards stabilizing climate change below dangerous levels, or whether we decide to throw out the progress that we've made in recent years.
Okay, before we get to my next question, I just want to interject. Michael, you used the 2 degrees Celsius mark, and this happens to be a personal bugaboo of mine, because the 2 degrees Celsius mark is from pre-industrial, and I'm just wondering how many of you were around here and remember how it felt in pre-industrial times. I mean, even us old men up here, and by the way, we're all men here, and that is another question we do want to know, why we're all men, only men up here. Why do scientists and now public officials use a 2 degrees Celsius from the 1800s when we've had 1 degree warming already? So you really are talking about a goal of 1 degree C from now.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you know, it is a standard that we use. It was the standard that the EU agreed upon in defining dangerous interference with the climate, because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change it instructed policymakers to prevent dangerous climate change, but it never defined it. And so now we're in this difficult position of trying to define what dangerous climate change is. Often the number 2 degrees Celsius warming relative to the pre-industrial is used. But as Seth says, we've already warmed the planet now more than 1 degree Celsius. And we've probably got another 0.5 degree Celsius already baked in just from the carbon that we've emitted so far. So that leaves a very small margin of only 0.5 degrees C. That's what we have to work with, and that gives you an idea of how urgently we have to reduce our carbon emissions if we're going to avoid breaching that. Now, that's 2 degrees Celsius. Low-lying island nations in the Pacific have rightfully argued that 2 degrees Celsius is too much warming. They will be flooded. They will disappear if we allow 2 degrees Celsius warming. For them, dangerous climate change has actually already arrived. And it's already arrived if you talk to farmers in California, ranchers in Texas, people in South Carolina, North Carolina, Louisiana. By some measure, it's already arrived. And the question is simply, how far down this road are we willing to go?
And Seth, let me just jump in there quickly and say, we don't want to quibble about how many degrees. I think it's more telling when you let people know that it's pretty well accepted that this is a non-linear process and that we won't be able to go back. We probably have already achieved irreversible changes.
Yeah, by some
and
measures,
that means something different to people than 2 degrees.
Well, that leads to the next question, which is, we're at the point where you are so close to where you are in the non-linear change, not just in climate change, in extinctions, and all sorts of issues, where at some point, since we're talking about policy, hard choices have to be made and perfect worlds don't exist. So for example, Peter, in the world of wildlife, are we at the point where we have to triage and say, these species are, we could spend a lot of money and maybe 10% chance of saving, or we could say, these are the goners, we're going to go for the ones we can save, and the ethical implications of just doing that. And for Michael and Raj, you've got energy sources that are either carbon-free or relatively carbon-free in nuclear, or lower carbon with natural gas and fracking. And at some point, is there this is we have to choose a lesser of two evils, at least for a little while. I'd like you to address those. Let's start with Peter on triaging species.
So, in amongst this extinction rate are some things which really should not be happening. It seems to me unbelievable that we have this incredible rate at which we're killing elephants at the moment, quite simply for the ivory. And if it continues, there will be no elephants by 2020. And when I talked, and most of this is driven by the Far Eastern market, particularly from China, where people are buying the ivory and importing the ivory. When you talk to, and I was invited to go to China, and I said, if I come, I need to be able to say that I am really disgusted by what the Chinese people are doing in encouraging this market, and they had no idea what I was talking about. There's a complete lack of understanding. We could stop this overnight, something as simple as that. So I think we could certainly solve those things. There again, when you go to places where you see the habitat is being destroyed, in parts of India, you see national parks with development right up to the border. There is absolutely nowhere the animals can be but inside the national park. And of course, they're losing that all the time and they're squeezing those animals out. What I would like to see is proper ecosystem control. And as Mike said, we are going to lose some species, and that's fine. I think it would be tragic to lose the tiger. I can't believe that my granddaughter will be in the world where there aren't tigers. I think that is just awful, dreadful thing to even think about. So I think we need a portfolio. We need a portfolio where we're going to be able to have the right sort of investment. I wouldn't want to throw anything out, but there are some obvious things that we could put right immediately.
Okay. Rush and Michael, how about the idea of, when we were all your age, there was a giant anti-nuclear energy movement. A climate scientist that you and I know, Ken Caldera, used to protest nuclear energy. Now he advocates for it as a alternative to climate change. What kind of choices have to be made on climate change that you wouldn't, imperfect choices?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm happy to tackle it first. We are going to have to make difficult choices if we're going to find a way to meet the growing global energy demand of a population that is now 7 million, maybe 9 million or more by the end of the century. And of course, we're seeing a transition of developing nations into a more industrial economy with greater energy demand. If we're going to meet that demand, and we're going to do it without continuing to burn carbon, then we do have a challenge upon us. Some have argued that we will need to employ nuclear energy as a bridge to a fossil fuel-free future. The thinking being that it will take 2 to 3 decades for us to build up the infrastructure. We have existing renewable energy technology that can provide the energy needs if scaled up massively, but it's going to take some time to scale up renewable energy to the point where it could satisfy 100% of energy demand. In the meantime, if we're going to find a way to meet that growing energy demand without continuing to burn carbon, we may have to make some difficult choices. Are we willing to, and it's a matter of risk management, because each of these choices comes with risk. Nuclear energy, of course, comes with environmental risk. It comes with proliferation, nuclear proliferation and security risks. So that has a particular footprint of risk. Climate change has an obvious footprint of risk. Natural gas is often described as being a potential bridge to a carbon-free future, and that's based on the assumption that that the only climate threat of natural gas is the CO2 that results when you burn it. Increasingly, we understand that a certain amount of natural gas during the process of fracking, hydraulic fracturing, natural gas recovery, some of that natural gas, which is mostly methane, escapes into the atmosphere. It turns out methane is an even more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, especially on a time frame of 1 to 2 decades. And if we're worried about crossing critical thresholds, then methane really becomes an issue. So it's unclear that when we take into account the fugitive methane from natural gas and the other environmental degradation, because remember, what we're trying to do is minimize an overall risk footprint. And some of the risk that comes with natural gas is the climate change that will result from it. But there's also a potential threat to water quality from the chemicals used in fracking. And yes, there's uncertainty. There are debates between scientists about the extent of these risks, but uncertainty is not a reason for consolation. Uncertainty often ends up breaking against us. When we learn more, we understand that things were actually worse than we initially thought. So I personally am somewhat skeptical that natural gas can play the role that some have argued it could play. Nuclear energy obviously has its own risk as well. So we've got a difficult conversation to have, and that's what Congress should be debating, right? How do we get to that fossil fuel-free future in a sustainable way where we can continue to grow the global economy? What Congress should be debating is whether climate change is real, whether we have a problem. And unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with right now. We have a Congress led by a Republican leadership that denies that climate change is real. We have one of the 2 major party candidates for president denies that climate change is real. We've got to get past that.
Rush, you were in Congress for a long time. Why doesn't Congress, one, understand this, to deal with the risk and have serious debate about risk and solutions?
I'm not sure what you're asking that Congress doesn't understand. There's a lot that Congress doesn't understand. A lot that they understand that we don't realize they understand. But if you were asking, going back to the question that led up to this, do we live with compromise? Are all choices not black or white? Well, yes, you're right. Everything certainly to do with energy, but with anything else too. You can condemn fossil fuels, but some are worse than others. Some are worse depending on how they're done. Similarly with nuclear power. I mean, nuclear power can work relatively safely if you don't build your plants in tsunami zones, if you don't have your emergency generators underwater, and so forth. But the real problem with nuclear power, if that's what you were asking about, is the so far inextricable connection between power and weapons. And I know proponents of nuclear power say, oh no, I'm talking about nuclear power. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. Well, if you don't think there's a link, why are people worried about Iran? I mean, they say they're just building a nuclear power plant. There's no question that there is a link. And humans have not yet demonstrated the ability to deal with nuclear weapons. We don't have the international regime to do it. I don't know what else you were asking about Congress. But
well, just Congress hasn't acted on climate or energy since
it's a complicated discussion. President Obama chose to do health care first as his really tough legislative task. Maybe he should have done energy first. There was too much hard feeling after the health care to deal constructively with energy. There were the usual regional problems of the senators from coal burning states or coal mining states and so forth. I think probably too long to get into.
Let's start going to questions. We have a question back here.
Hi, sorry. My name is Suzanne Nichols. I'm actually a visitor to Penn State tonight, and I have a question more specifically about Congress. It's kind of a follow-up. the Committee on Science and Technology has proved mostly adversarial with the scientific community. Number one, why do you think that is? And number two, what can the scientific community do to kind of get them back in our corner?
The basic problem is issues that traditionally have been thought of having to do with science are now thought of as ideological, politically ideological. By science, I mean a way of asking questions so that they can be answered empirically and verifiably, or in short, based on evidence. Evidence that is collected, curated, examined, and communicated using the norms of science. And that is missing from the Science Committee largely. I was beginning to argue a few minutes ago that it's missing from our society largely. That's the bigger problem. And when it comes to science communication, the real challenge in front of us is not to make it clear and simple whatever issue you're talking about. The real challenge in front of us is to get people to realize that public questions can be answered most reliably using evidence. And we now have the chair of the House Science Committee, for example, right now reiterating, I think this week, reiterating what he has said repeatedly in the past, that the National Science Foundation research projects must be demonstrably in the national interest. He's stepping aside from the norms of science, the peer review, the way the validity of a research project has been and should be determined, and instead applying a ideological test. That's why we can't make progress.
And what's Chairman Lamar Smith's science background?
Well, actually, he's a smart, academically trained person, not in science.
He's a lawyer, right?
That's right. But he has a postgraduate degree in, well, I don't quite remember. Anyway, the point, it doesn't do any good to dismiss him as ignorant about science, because that's not really the issue. It's not how well does he know the terminology, the methodology of science, because you just won't find many. There were three of us who were PhD physicists in Congress recently. There are a handful of other people that have some training in science, but really a handful. So therefore, almost nobody there knows the terminology, the technology, the methodology of science. And you're wasting your time to expect that you'll educate all 535 of them. But we could, I hope, get back to what was an American tradition of respect for evidence.
But this is based around education, isn't it? Don't we need to be educating children?
Yes.
Don't we need to have more respect for our school teachers in particular? I mean, I'm always shocked that school teachers get paid on average something like $45,000. That's a dreadful salary for that's such an important job that they do. But it is education is our problem.
We devote some space in the Madhouse effect to Lamar Smith, and I agree with Rush. I don't think the problem here is ignorance. I think it's antipathy. I think there's a genuine antipathy by Lamar Smith and similar ideologically driven colleagues of his towards science, which they view purely through an ideological prism. Climate change. They have come to view it entirely as a political matter, and I think what's very telling is a statement that was made by James Inhofe of Oklahoma, probably the lead climate change denier in the US Senate, the senior senator from Oklahoma, who a few years ago made the following statement: "I used to believe the science until I learned how much it would cost." So that tells you everything you need to know. Working back from an ideological view that regulation is bad to whatever science he thinks he needs to believe to support that view. I'm reminded of a famous saying attributed to former New York Senator Daniel P. Moynihan: "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." And I think, just as Rush said, we now live in a world where, so it's a larger problem, it's a larger societal problem. We live in a world where people feel entitled to their own facts. And if you don't like, the laws of physics, there's a whole cable network that is perfectly happy to defy them in the way they characterize climate change and any number of other issues. So that's really the problem. The problem with our political discourse on climate change, I think, is part of a much more fundamental problem with the lack of good faith discourse in our society today.
Okay, we're going to go some more questions here. And there aren't many of you lining up here. We have one person here. Please ask more, line up here. So let's go over this side first again. Go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering what the three of you think about how the CRISPR-Cas9 discoveries will change policy in the future of kind of the health science industry. Thank you.
The question was about how CRISPR technology will change future of health science and technology, and basically, in many instances, just the world. This is more for you. I think this is up to
CRISPR technology is basically about gene editing, and I think this could be immensely important in the future. I think it's something that science has already started to embrace, and I think we're going to see that develop into a very important part of components like regenerative medicine. And the ideas that we'll be able to replace your liver, for example, things like this. So I think it has an immensely important role to play.
And Rush, what about the ethical impacts?
Yeah, I mean, just for you who aren't familiar, I made reference to that earlier when I was saying we've learned how bacteria defend themselves against viruses. They use a CRISPR kind of technique, and we've realized this is a very efficient way of editing genes. And it will almost surely be used in a number of beneficial ways, doing away with genetic diseases, maybe not all genetic diseases, but many, most, quite possible, quite likely, I would say. So there are benefits, but like any tool, it comes with ethical questions. The more powerful a tool, whether it's an automatic firearm or something else, the greater the ethical implications of its use. And CRISPR-Cas9 is a very powerful tool. It's not new. We've been editing genes now for some decades. And there have even been techniques where graduate students, and that's some of you, have the ability to edit genes. It's just becoming easier now with the CRISPR-Cas9 technique.
So what are you most worried about? Let's spell out some of the potential ethical landmines.
Well, kind of in a general sense, I'm concerned that this will be done without good public debate, because no scientist should be arrogant enough to believe that she or he has either a corner on wisdom or judgment, or has better ethical sense. Science actually, at root, is a very democratizing influence. It is anti-aristocratic, anti-authoritarian in its nature. And so what worries me rather than talking about the specifics of how it might be misused, I'm afraid it will be used in ways that are even thought to be good, or the researcher thinks it will be good, or the physician or somebody thinks it will be good, without taking it public. These are decisions that have to be made by society at large, and the first ethical obligation of the scientist, the researcher, is to recognize the ethical responsibility to communicate in a way that the public can make the ethical choices.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you for this panel, and this is Mehmet Böke. I'm a PhD candidate at entomology here at Penn State. I'm a PhD candidate in entomology. The question is, so I'm kind of going to bring it back to local scale. So at Penn State, there has been a series of events being held by a Penn State affiliated organization. It's called International Ministry at Penn State. And the previous one was about how climate change is a lie. And this one, which is tomorrow, is about how evolution is a lie.
How, what, I'm sorry?
Evolution is a lie, according to them. So the question becomes, this is a Penn State affiliated organization, and they're using Penn State rooms, Penn State resources, and they're talking about those stuff. So do you think that's a good way of using public university resources, and are we sending the wrong message by that?
Michael, first part was climate.
Thank you.
It's here at Penn State.
Well, it's a university community, and we have to be open to all honest viewpoints. That's part of what academic freedom is about, and I think we all value academic freedom, we may not like at times where it leads us, but we have to recognize the rights of people to make whatever arguments they want to make. But I do feel that there is an assumption, a requirement of good faith. And sometimes there are those individuals, and our book is all about that. It's about climate change denial and the ways that climate change deniers have often sort of taken advantage of the good faith, for example, that the scientific community operates under. We operate under a set of rules, and we're not used to playing with, to dealing with people who don't play by those rules, who don't play fair, who don't really respect the tenets of science and attempt to co-opt the terminology, for example. And we see that with evolution, intelligent design. It's all about co-opting the terminology of science to advance what is ultimately not a scientific agenda. And we see the same thing with climate change. So I do think that we have a right to demand that a certain level of good faith, and if we feel that individuals or organizations are violating that fundamental tenet, that fundamental assumption, then there's reason to question whether it is an appropriate use of university resources. I don't pretend to be able to litigate that myself. We have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. I think in the end we have to err on the side of openness and allowing viewpoints that might not be appealing to us, arguments that we don't think are sound, we don't even think they're scientific. But there has to be a certain level of tolerance because it can work the other way. There have been times in the past where there was an intolerance that was levied against science. We have to be respectful of that.
Now, if I can play editor here for a moment, is it fair to take what you just said here and edit it down to re-quoting Michelle Obama, when they go high, we go low? I mean, when they go low, we go high? Isn't that what basically you're saying? When they go low, we go high?
I don't pretend to be nearly as eloquent as Michelle Obama, but yes, I would agree with that.
All right, let's go over on this side.
Hi there, I'm Kayla Thorne. I'm a graduate student with Agriculture and Extension Education, so it's more of the human side versus the hard science side. But I deal with climate change and agricultural producers' perspectives on it. And I'm curious in applying this question outside of the climate change realm as well. But if we have the science within the United States and globally agreeing on climate change and anthropogenic climate change, what is the next step in getting laymen and the general population to start working towards more contentious topics, even as a conversation point? I think that can be applied to even the extension, and curious how policy can fit into it.
Peter, why don't you start?
I'm not quite sure what the question was. No, I didn't quite. There were bits of it I had, but what is the specific question?
I don't know if I can articulate the specific question. We have hard topics. We have topics that people don't agree on, and perhaps science suggests they should agree on them. How can we communicate that in a way that people who do not understand and do not speak the scientific languages, how do they understand that?
So how do we communicate the facts in a better way? Is
Yes.
that the question? So that we can get on to more contentious issues?
Yes.
So, you know, I've been going to Africa for 42 years, and I was in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was released. And Nelson Mandela, without question, is one of my great heroes in life. And he said that education is the most powerful weapon for changing the future. And I really totally endorse that. And there are things wrong with our education system, globally as well as within this country. But I think the opportunities we have are just phenomenal, particularly when we can start using our phones. So in Africa, 10 years ago, nobody had a phone. Everybody has 3 phones now. Everybody's using their phones. There's ways we can use the internet, we can get the message out there, but there's also the ways it can be abused as well. And this comes back to these balances that Rush was talking about earlier. I would hope, and I have faith in the system, and I have faith in the education system, that people will listen to that. And I'm an optimist in that respect, that we will start to be able to do that. And I think you educate people, you get people to think. You put those people together and they can argue and discuss things, and that's what university is all about, which partly answers the last question as well. I think in terms of the resources, I think they should be given the stage, exactly as Mike said. But I don't know how much, I'm not sure we should be throwing finances at it that's coming out of undergraduate tuition. But I think I've partly answered your question.
I don't think there's a set of facts that we're trying to communicate, that we should be trying to communicate to put this behind us. Let me illustrate with kind of a simple story. Very recently, a student came up to me and said, "Do you believe in climate change?" And I said, "It's not a matter of belief." And that's what we have to get over on the issue of climate change, whether it applies to agriculture or ocean fisheries, whatever it is. It's not, this is not an ideology that you choose to believe in or not. It is where the evidence leads us. And we won't get people to look at it that way by making assertions, or for that matter, even trying to educate them on the science. What we need to do is educate them about what science is, so they too can think like a scientist.
I think I was just going to sort of echo that. I think that's very true. There's a great saying along the lines of what Rush was alluding to. Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of our great science communicators, the great thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe it. and it, just as Rush was saying, and I'll use a different anecdote. It's the allegory, or it's the old saying that, and it's a little more gendered than I would like, but you teach a man you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Person to fish, you feed them for a day. You teach them to fish, you feed them for life. And the same thing is true when it comes to matters of science. Science isn't a set of facts, it's a way of thinking about the world. It's a way of approaching problems and thinking about problems. And it's that we have to teach people how to fish. We have to make sure, instill an understanding of that way of looking at the world through evidence and logical argumentation. And when they have that as a resource, then they're in a much better position to arbitrate the difficult decisions that people encounter when trying to figure out who's right in a scientific debate. If you give them the tools of critical thinking and just the tools of science, then you equip them to sort of to figure things out themselves rather than just handing them a set of facts. You hand them a set of facts, but as soon as you're gone, somebody else can hand them an alternative set of facts, and they're no better off.
So-called facts.
So-called facts, exactly.
Yes.
Their own facts. So yeah, I
think your point about belief rush was very important. It's the same in evolution as well. We know evolution, we know natural selection takes place. We wouldn't have antimicrobial resistance, for example. Time and time again, we know it takes place, and it's not a belief.
I wonder if there are people who say they don't believe in evolution who take the flu shot every year, right?
All right, let's get to the next question over on this side here.
Hi, earlier we were talking about how there's been a change in education where it's less evidence-based, but it's been my experience, and polls sort of suggest that the most anti-science people are actually of an older generation. So I'm wondering, as a female PhD candidate in geosciences, how can I reach that demographic that so doesn't want to listen to me?
And also, let me add one thing to that. If you look at the research and polling data from people like Dan Kahan at Yale, they say that some of the biggest climate change deniers have higher levels of education and understanding about climate change. It is just the politics get involved here.
Other researchers have actually challenged Dan's claim. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about how do you reach the elderly and the people who are, on this claim who are educated about the issue and still deny reality.
My hope is through lifelong education. I think lifetime expectancy has gone up hugely. People have a large proportion, the older people have a large proportion of time that they can utilize. And I would hope that lifelong education becomes part of our society in a much bigger way. And I want undergraduates, I want postgraduates to realize this is fun. This is not difficult. This is just downright fun. And I think the older generation should experience that, and they should be shown what fun it is. So, let's pull them into the village, which is our retirement home up the road, and let's try and get them coming to these talks. Let them get involved with the university. Let them become involved more in society.
Let me add a thought along those lines. There is some segment of the population. There have been studies using what's known as segmentation analysis to sort of take the U.S. population and figure out what the different constituencies are when it comes to issues like climate change. And you have sort of the alarmed at one end of the scale and the dismissive at the other end of the scale. There was a report, the 6 Americas, so there's 6 different groups and they span that whole spectrum. And one of the findings is that when you take the dismissives, these are people who are proactively against the science of climate change. They're not happy enough denying it. They want to make sure that you know that they deny it. It's Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving who, comes armed with the latest talking points from the radio program that he listens to. And you're not going to win them over. In many cases, they're coming at this from an ideological standpoint, and facts and figures and logic aren't going to make a difference because they don't see it as a matter of facts and figures and logic. They see it as an ideological framework. It's a tribal it's part of their tribal identity. If you're going to be a faithful member of that tribe, climate change denial is one of the things that you need to do. And my own view is that we have a finite amount of time in our lives, and our effort might be better spent focused on winning over those who are genuinely confused. They believe that there's a scientific debate where there in fact is none. And if they were led to understand the degree of consensus that does exist within the scientific community, there's a good chance that you'll move them over, not just to accepting the science, but to be motivated enough to actually want to do something about it. And my argument would be that many of our efforts are better spent on that sort of persuadable middle, where we could waste a lot of time trying to convince Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving, and he's never going to come around.
If you want to know more about the Six Americas study, climatecommunication.yale.edu. That's Tony Lyserowicz's group there. Let's go.
Just to finish on that, or make another comment on it, the best scientists, in the sense the people who think most like a scientist, are third graders and under. They know how to ask questions so they can be answered empirically and verifiably. They may not know the words empirical or verifiable, but they understand experiment, evidence gathering, communicating that openly, having somebody else check your work. That's science. And you know, I think the best way to bring people of any age into this is to let them know what a great adventure science is, how enormously empowering it is to think that way, and that it is, well, as Lewis Thomas, the biologist and one of the finest essayists in the English language, said, it is the shrewdest maneuver for understanding. The shrewdest, isn't that a wonderful phrase? Lewis Thomas had a way with words. And so say to them, you know, when you sent me off to college, Grandma, I was let in on a secret that I'm going to let you in on. There is this marvelous way of thinking that protects us against fooling ourselves.
Yes, use our grandchildren.
It is 8 o'clock right now. I asked Jared if we can, if you need to leave, it's okay, but we're going to ask Jared if we can continue for 10 more minutes, and he said yes, so we're going to continue for 15 more. So let's keep going. I think it's questions over here now.
Thank you all for being here. My question is I'm looking for some comments on the media as a whole, not as a set of bad guys, but as perhaps I'm interested in the role that you think they play in communicating science, and whether or not they have a role in tribalism, like you've talked about, or a role in the perception that facts are subjective.
I'd like to hear that from you guys.
No, I think you should answer that one, Seth.
First of all, I think one big thing is that there is no the media. There is many media. So you look at, to be honest, Fox News, MSNBC, those two, yes, they both are on cable, but there's not much else you can say that connects them. And you take the New York Times, the National Enquirer, they're both media. I don't think they like being in the same thing together, but yet the media bears a role here. And part of it is you are seeing a shrinking of the news media for various reasons. Most of it is technological and inability to cope with technology and adapt. But we have newspapers, and some of them still exist. We still have, there are fewer science writers out there. I'm a science writer, and I feel like I'm one of Peter's endangered species. So there are fewer of us. So people who don't know science, who don't know how to ask the right questions, are doing jobs that in the past, science, environment writers, medical writers. Part of that is because you're not willing to pay for it. How many people here pay for a subscription to a newspaper?
You've got a biased sample.
Yes, because and then Craigslist has killed us. newspapers used to make a ton of money on classified ads. So that doesn't excuse it, because there's also there is a long bias, especially when you're looking at it as a political reporter. You get two sides, what we call the he said, she said. But I think you're seeing that changing a lot, especially when it comes to climate change. There are far fewer stories out there that are on the, that have the obligatory climate change doubter out there. You look at mine, you don't see those, except on some occasions where they fit. And if you look at this, not just in science, we see fact checks. You see instant fact checks everywhere. I mean, even small weekly newspapers have fact checks now. In the old days, media would just report what happened, maybe give analysis, but now we're fact checking. And some politicians may not like that. So let's hear from you, some of you gentlemen.
My own sense, I sort of got into that world in the late 90s after we published, the original hockey stick article, and I've sort of been immersed in the larger public discourse over climate change for a couple decades now. And I've been able to view a remarkable transition over that period. That is when we basically transitioned from sort of the traditional media that I grew up with, where you had 3 network news programs, and Walter Cronkite would say that's the way it was on October 17th. 13th. Yeah, it's been a long week. And we all accepted that that's the way it was. We could differ in our opinions of what those facts implied. But getting back to that earlier statement, there was a common set of facts. Now we live in this very divided world where people can trap themselves inside their own sort of selective media bubble. And if you don't like the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of the network news programs, as I said before, there's a whole network that you can watch. There's a number of newspapers whose editorial pages you can read where you would think that climate change is an elaborate hoax perpetrated by China, for example. So we've lost something. At the same time, the sort of emergence of the internet and the new media is very democratizing, but it's also allowed us to siphon ourselves off into these insular bubbles where we can trap ourselves within our own preconceptions and misconceptions. And I think that's dangerous, where you can have different populations that disagree fundamentally on what the basic facts are. It's part of that larger problem we were talking about, part of the reason for the loss of good faith in our discourse. There are great science writers like Seth that are still out there, but the CNN laid off their entire science and technology team a few years ago. We've seen this massive a hemorrhaging of science journalism, and in its place what happens is journalists who don't have the sort of background that Seth has are asked to litigate these he said, she said debates, and will tend by default to treat them as if they're just another political debate, when in fact in matters of science there is objective truth. And so we've lost something as well in this transition, and I don't know that we fully appreciate the new world that we live in when it comes to how we get our news and how we think about things.
Let me just get to newspapers for one thing, one quick point here. Newspapers, even the Wall Street Journal, where the editorial page denies climate change is happening, on the news pages you have some very good science writers writing about climate science. The Washington Times, owned by some very
the Moonies.
Yes. Very ultra-conservative editorial page will run my stories on climate change and other stories on climate change. There is a hard difference between editorial pages in newspapers, not in television, in newspapers and the news coverage.
In some, science writers need our help, and we can help them. And I mean that with no disrespect or denigration.
Yes, trust me, science writers, all reporters always could use help. I mean, none of us, So if you end up having to deal with a reporter in the future, which is a good thing, that means you've done something good generally, just don't be afraid of us. We don't bite. And we try to do the right thing. And as I told the group earlier, use analogies. That helps us understand.
And Google the person. When you hear from a
Yes.
journalist, Google them first. See
Yeah.
their past work. Yeah.
Okay, let's go over here to the gentleman in the plaid shirt.
Thanks. My question kind of takes us back to the beginning of what we were talking about with extinction. So really, Peter, I think this question is more directed towards you. And when we were talking about extinction, you brought up a lot of really charismatic, large organisms that I understand the appeal to the audience, especially, to bring those up. But right here in our own backyard, we're losing, in the last 10 years, millions of bats to a disease called white nose syndrome. We've lost, since the 1980s, over 170 species of amphibians
Honeybees.
to chytrid, and there are just tons of disease of bees as well. So all of these diseases that don't seem to make the big headlines that panda bears, tigers, and lions do. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how we can go about kind of changing the face of communication on the front of diseases, especially wildlife diseases and extinction in that realm?
Wow. So I do think the white nose syndrome, the chytrids in the frogs, has been devastating and really worrying. Why has this come about now, or has this happened in the past and we've not been aware of it? I don't know. It's interesting that both of those diseases are caused by fungi, and it's not what we would usually expect to cause those diseases. We usually expect it to be viruses. And of course, we saw a massive response by the whole world to the Ebola outbreak, and it was an outbreak that nobody predicted, and it went to the extent that it did, which was much bigger than we would ever have expected to take place, and it turned up on our doorstep. It turned up here as well. So there's much more concern about the global health and how we try and look at that. How do we get this across to the media is worrying. And I'm sort of worried about it because one of the issues that I'm tackling with myself at the moment is that I'm often told that the reason we're not doing better as a scientist is we're not being able to explain ourselves correctly. We're not being able to get the message out there so that even NPR doesn't pick it up. That sort of is worrying me. I'm not convinced it really is the fault of scientists. Quite a lot of scientists I listen to are extremely good at expressing their views, presenting the science in a clear way. I'm sort of slowly moving, and I've been listening to the debate here, of course, but I also believe that we're moving towards a situation where it's getting this response and and people being more concerned about their environment, more concerned about the future. So I think some of the things that Mike said were very important in that respect. You bring up a massive subject as far as I'm concerned, because it's very close to my heart. But I think I ought to stop there, otherwise I could go for an hour.
Well, I was going to add one thought. I was involved in a NSF-funded project to help zoos and aquaria across the country develop outreach materials about climate change. And I can tell you the reason that there's emphasis on the charismatic megafauna is they're charismatic. I mean, that's the way you grab people's attention, as with the panda bears and the polar bears. And the reason the polar bear has become sort of the poster child of climate change is because it is a charismatic animal. And I think the thinking, if sort of, summarizing what I gathered from my colleagues in the zoological community was, you engage people through those charismatic, animals, and you capture their attention and their concern, and then you've got an opportunity to teach them. And it's a real challenge to teach at a zoo, because people go there to see cool animals. They don't go there to learn about stuff. So there's a delicate balance there. But if you can garner their attention with the polar bears, then there's an opportunity there to provide them more information, to provide them resources that they can go to online, and that's where you can get into the larger dimensions of the problem. So I think there is a method there. Yeah.
And I think what you'll see is, you mentioned bees, And there has been an awful lot of coverage. I mean, I know this, I do an awful lot on bees. And bees like bats, you know, that's something that in general people tend to not be overly favorable about. You know, people fear them. They think of sting. Bats, they think wrongly of bites and whatever. But with bees, it was a very simple way to tell people, here's why it matters. And I think this is, as a scientist, one of the ways you want to communicate is, why does it matter? And with bees, it matters because no bees, lots of food is gone. I mean, pollinators, which I guess includes bats, provide, you know, I used to have the number memorized, and I wish I did, but I don't have it now. Such a large percentage of our diet. And people paid attention because of that. The Obama administration has actually instituted a giant bee policy, even though we're still trying to struggle with the direct causes, especially of something like CCD, because it's so complex. But when you can explain why it matters while standing on one foot, then you got it. Let's go.
Hi, I was kind of wondering, we talked a lot about tonight about how to help the general public understand science, the scientific process, so that they can better appreciate the facts that we do provide to the society. But I was kind of wondering, on the flip side of this, are there complexity in policy making that scientists, like us scientists, don't appreciate? And so things like that perhaps can help us better present arguments or present solutions to policymakers and such that would help push our agendas forward.
That sounds like for you, Rush.
Yes, there are complexities in policymaking that most people, including scientists, don't understand. You know, I often said when I left physics to go to Congress, I found it intellectually, psychologically, and physically more difficult than anything I had ever done. It is, you know, it can be very complicated. And you learn it over a long time, and certainly in dealing with policymakers, and I think all of us have some responsibility to be involved in, at some level, in the political process and the policymaking process. As we get involved, we have to be respectful of the people who do it. You know, it doesn't do any good to call the chairman of a committee, you know, an ignoramus. You just won't get anywhere, and besides, chances are she's not. So, you know, how do you learn those things? Like anything else, you apprentice somehow. You spend some time advising, you spend some time working on policy reports or assisting the local town council member in developing policy. And you know, most people, you know, as I think you heard at the beginning, I was a AAAS science policy fellow. I took a year out from my college teaching to work on Capitol Hill. And the very first day, as we scientists were there in the orientation program, somebody said, you have to understand that here in Washington, facts are negotiable. Well, you know, we squirmed nervously in our seats, wondering what we'd gotten ourselves into for a year. But fortunately, most of us, I think, didn't dismiss it and say, I'm out of here. We spent the year trying to understand what the hell he meant by saying that. And, you know, developed a real respect for how they think about things.
Now, we are 30% past our, we've used our allotted time. So I'm going to have to ask one last 10-second each of you answer, you know, question for answer. And just, I want to return to the very beginning and try to leave us with something a little more positive than some of the discussion today. Tell us what makes you most hopeful for future generations thanks to science and maybe the intersection of science policy? What gives you the most hope? 10 seconds, and let's start with Peter.
So, without doubt, most of the issues we've talked about are about population growth rate. We know we can reduce population growth rate if we see equality and if we educate women properly across the world. I believe that we can do that, and I believe there are changes there. And I'm really hopeful by educating women that we can actually do the right thing and stop population growth.
And Michael, let's go with you and then finish with Rush.
Okay, well, I'll pander to the audience here. Millennials, I think that millennials get it when it comes to issues like climate change. There's an amazing generational gulf, but millennials really get it. They understand, what the science has to say. They understand it's a problem, literally an existential challenge, and they're hopefully in November going to hold policymakers accountable when it comes to issues like climate. I hope that millennials are going to come out in much greater proportion than some of the prognosticators think, and they're going to vote on issues like climate, and not just at the top of the ticket, but all the way down.
What gives me the most hope is a sense of history. I made reference at the very beginning to America's, and this is speaking about America, but you can extrapolate to other places, America's reverence for evidence, traditional reverence for evidence. We're a very empirical, practical-minded country in our founding, in our culture. If you look at the Federalist Papers for the ratification of the Constitution, the word experiment appeared much more often than the word democracy. We look for evidence, or we have traditionally. So I'm sure we can get back to that.
And if you don't mind me taking the prerogative to interject, my answer here is humanity over time has become more peaceful, far less violent. I recommend Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature. Murder is down, war is down, prejudice is down, and this is as we get more civilized. So, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. I think we could spend another hour or two here, so very much appreciate it, and a hand for our